And we will say that tonight's shiur is Le'iloi Nishmat Avi Mori Do Ber Meir Ben Reuven Halevi, Imi Morati Rachel Bat Harav Michael. And we'll wait one more second because Rita just joined. So let's, okay. Wait a minute till she joins and then we'll get started. Okay. Okay. Rita, can you hear me? Oh, you're still not connected to her. I can't hear you yet. You're not connected yet. Hold on a minute. Still connected. Okay, away we go. So tonight we're going to talk about the sale of Yosaif, if I can get my screen to work and my mouse to work. And let's minimize this. Is this okay? And one second here. Oh, come on. Okay, and away we go. Sorry about the technical difficulties, and we're ready to start. Okay, so the parshat of Vayayshev, we know the story. Yosaif and the brothers. Yaakov gives Yosaif this ketonet pasim, whatever that is. The brothers are all upset. They want to get rid of him, and the brothers now go off shepherding somewhere near Shechem. Yaakov sends Yosaif to find out what's happening with the brothers, and the brothers see him, and they decide to throw him in a pit. After first, Reuven says, well, first two of the brothers say, let's kill him. Reuven says, now let's throw him in the pit. And after they've thrown him in the pit, the following is what transpires. It says, Vayayshev lechol lechem. They sat down to break bread. They raised their eyes and they saw there was a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilad, which would be, if they were in Shechem, which would be to the north and east. So it would be traveling southwest. And their camels were carrying the chod, all sorts of wonderful spices, and they were on their way southwest to Egypt. So Yehuda says to his brothers in verse 26, what profit will we have if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Let us go and sell him to the Yishmaelim, who they see in the distance coming. The Adenu al tivo, and our hand should not be upon him. Kiachinu v'sarenu, because in the end he is our brother. Vayishmu achav, and the brothers heard. Now Rashi comments very similar. Vayishmu here is they heard and they agreed. So there was an agreement, it seems, according to where based on Yehuda suggests, to sell Yosaif to the Yishmaelim. However, we have the next verse, which is the verse that raises all the issues in this week's parsha that we're going to talk about. So Midianite traders, socharim means merchants, passed by, and they drew up. Vayalu et Yosef min habor, they raised Yosef from this pit where the brothers had thrown him. Vayimkeru et Yosef la Yishmaelim be'esrim kasef. And they, we're going to figure out who the they is, sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver by Aviyo et Yosef Mitzrayim, and they brought Joseph to Egypt. Now, you'll notice that there are a number of pronouns in this verse that are very, very challenging to understand. So we know that there are a couple of nouns. There are some Midianite, male Midianite traders, merchants, who passed by. they drew Yosef from the pit, and they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 kesef, 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Yosef to Egypt. Now, we know that in general, biblical narrative is supposed to elucidate rather than hide. So generally a pronoun refers to the most recently mentioned noun. This is the general principle in Torah understanding. So if I take this verse and understand it on a very seemingly literal sense, it says that Midianite traders, merchants passed by. The Midianite merchants drew down, they sent down a rope and they raised Joseph from the pit, and the Midianite merchants sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and the Ishmaelites, who are now the last mentioned noun, are the ones who brought Joseph to Egypt. So that's what it seems from verse 28. If we look later on in the story at verse 36, we are told about another group. Hamidanim, the Medanites, not the Midian, not to be confused with the Midianites, although it is very confusing. The Medanites sold him, be referring to Joseph, El Mitzrayim, to Egypt, Potiphar, to Potiphar, the officer of Paro, who was in charge of he was either the chief butcher or he was either the chief executioner, whichever interpretation of Sarah Tabachim you wish to take. But that's not the point here. The point is we have a number of different groups who are identified. We have Midianim, we have Yishmaelim, we have Midanim, we have Egyptian, Potiphar, and of course we have the brothers. So there are a lot of different parties involved, and it's going to be very interesting to try to unravel exactly what's going on here. Okay, one more verse later on, which by the way is a chapter later, the Torah after the verse 36 that we just quoted, Lamed Vav that was just quoted. There's a whole chapter in the Torah that interrupts the whole narrative of Yosaif to tell us about Yehuda and Tamar. And then immediately after that, we are told to Yosaif Hurad Mitzrayim that Yosef had been brought down to Egypt, Vayiknehu, and he was purchased by Potiphar against Sris Parosara Tabachim, Ish Mitzri. But who did he buy him from? Miyad HaYishmaelim, Asher Horidu Shama. Potiphar purchased Yosef from the hand of the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. So now if you look in the blue, you'll notice that firstly in the yellow, you'll notice there are three different sales mentioned. There is a sale mentioned in verse 28, a sale mentioned in verse 36, and a purchase mentioned in verse 1 of chapter 39, which is the others are in chapter 37. So we have three different times where Yosef seems to be sold or bought, and we have different parties. I've highlighted green is the purchaser. Now, two of these purchasers seem to be the same. Potiphar in verse 36, as well as in verse 1, seems to be the purchaser. But again, he has two different sellers selling it to him. In verse 36, it's the Medanites who are selling it to him. In verse 1 of chapter 39, it's the Ishmaelites who are selling it. And we really don't know who the seller is in verse 28. So we have a number of different possible sellers, possible buyers, and possible transactions. Now, just as a matter of background, two things we want to note. When Joseph and the brothers are reunited, in a couple of weeks from now, we'll read about it in parshat Vayayshev, after we have our Hanukkah break of Miketz. Yosaif himself, when the brothers are in front of him and he reveals who he is, he says, Ani Yosef achichem asher machartem oti Mitzrayim. I am Yosef, your brother, who you sold me to Egypt. And he says, don't worry that you sold me. Twice he repeats this, you sold me. So that's another thing we have to take into account in trying to understand what happened in terms of all these transactions, that Yosef himself says to the brothers, you sold me, and they don't contradict him. And finally, just again, more background here, just so you understand who all these different tribes of people that we've mentioned are. We know, of course, that Yishmael is descended from Abraham and Hagar, Sarah's maid servant, who tells Avram to marry her. That was who Yishmael is. But later on, we find that after Sarah's death, Avram takes as a wife a person named Keturah, and she has a number of sons, two of whom are Midan and Midyan. So we should understand that clearly Ishmaelites, the Jews, the Midanites, Midianites, all of these are Abrahamic tribes. So we have to understand that Midan and Midyan are very related, definitely have the same parentage. Yishmael, same father, possibly the same mother, according to Medrash, it says Keturah is none other than Hagar. And then there's Yosaif and his brothers who were descended also from Avram, but clearly through Yitzchak. So we have a lot of family things going on here with all of these different tribes involved. So just so you have a little bit of a scorecard before we start going through all the procedures, so you know who everybody is, at least to start. Okay, we're going to start, obviously, as we always generally do, with Rashi's comments. And Rashi tells us a very interesting thing. Now, we read it in verse 25 that the brothers were sitting and they see a caravan approaching from the distance. And then in verse 28, seems to be another group who are introduced. So Rashi says, when it says that these Anashim Midyanim, these Midianites who came and are involved somehow with raising Joseph from the pit, Zuhi Shiara Acheret. This was an entirely different caravan. A second caravan, obviously for whatever reason, maybe it was too small, the brothers didn't see it, maybe it was off in a different direction. They were all looking in one direction, don't know, but it was a different caravan, according to Rashi. And the verse wants us to understand that Yosaif changes hands. He is bought and sold a number of different times. As the Midrash says, one Midrash has 4, one Midrash has 3, but there are a number of different transactions where Yosaif changes hands. And that's exactly why this verse is here to introduce the second caravan. So there was trading between the two caravans, it seems, as well as the brothers. And Rashi says that this is to understand that how traumatic this whole experience was for Yosef, that he's bought and sold numerous times. Now, Rashi, in interpreting the pasuk that we said, Vayayshev, again, we said Vayayshev is they. In this case means they lowered a rope, basically. Now Rashi doesn't say this is referring to the Midianites, which is what we would have assumed based on normal Torah use, but biblical usage. He says he adds 2 words: Vayimshechu b'nei Yaakov et Yosef bin Abor, Vayimkeru la'Yishmaelim. That it was Jacob's sons, the brothers, who lowered a rope so Yosef could come out of the pit and sold him to the Yishmaelites. Now then Rashi adds that the Yishmaelim, Lemidyanim, the Yishmaelites sold him to this passing caravan of Midianites, and the Midianites sold him to Egypt. So Rashi is first and foremost telling us, inserting the brothers into verse 28 where they don't appear, but they do appear in 27, 25, 26, 27. All the verses before that are talking about the brothers. So it could make sense from Rashi's perspective that clearly it's the brothers who are the ones who are the first sellers of Yosef. Interestingly enough, though, Rashi says the Midanim and the Midyanim are one and the same. And so Yosef goes from the brothers to the Ishmaelites to the Midianites, Medanites, and then to the Egyptians. So he's only sold 3 times, according to Rashi. Now, Sifsei Chachamim wants to try to understand what forced Rashi to say that the Vayimshechu, that the ones who sent down this rope to raise up Yosef is the brothers. What forced him to say that? Why couldn't he have assumed that it was the Midianite merchants who lowered the rope and raised Yosef from the pit? So Sifsei Chachamim explains, Dayak, Rashi is extrapolating midichsiv, because the verse says, Vayimshechu vayalu et Yosef min habor vayimkeru. That all 3 of these things, the ones who sent down the rope, who helped raise Joseph out of the pit and sold him, are all 3 pronouns that have to refer to the same noun antecedent. So he is saying that and if this is referring to the Midianite traders, how did they have the rights to Yosef to be able to sell him? He did not belong to them. So therefore, Rashi is forced to say that the only one who could have sold Yosaif was the brothers. They were the ones who, quote, had the rights to him. At least at this point in time, they were the ones who threw him in the pit. They seemed to have control over him. They were the only ones who could have sold him. So Rashi is forced to say that, to insert the brothers into this pasuk, even though they're not. The ode, another reason Rashi says, if we say that the midjanim are the ones who raised him up, which is what the normal usage would be, below Yediyat Achim, without the brothers knowing about it, and they sold him. If that's the case, why did Yosaif say, how could Yosaif accuse the brothers of being the ones who sold him if they had no knowledge of it? These Midianites happened to show up on the scene, heard Yosaif in the pit, picked him up, sold him, but the brothers didn't know anything about it. How can Yosaif say you're the ones who sold him? Okay? And now Rashi and the Siddur Chachamim says Rashi had another reason why. The ode. Why would the Torah have told us that the brothers planned to sell him if they didn't carry through that plan? So the fact that the Torah bothered to tell us in the pasuk before that the brothers had planned to sell him means they must have carried through that plan, and we see it right here. Ella, and Rashi says, therefore, Vayimshechu, the ones who drew him up from the pit were Koi al bnei Yaakov. Has to be referring to Jacob's sons, the brothers. Vehem mecharu Yishmaelim. They sold him to the Yishmaelim, the first caravan, and the Yishmaelim sold him to the Midyanim, the second. The Yishmaelim of the first caravan sold him to the Midyanim of the second caravan. Okay, and now that's Rashi's understanding of the sequence of events. Now the Siddur Chachamim goes a little further. Why does Rashi bring in the fact that the Yishmaelim sold him to the Midyanim rather than the Midanim? We never have the Midyanim. If we say that the people who drew him out of the pit were the brothers and they sold him to the Yishmaelim, the Midianite traders never had possession of Yosaif. What forces Rashi to say that they were the ones that the Ishmaelites sold him to them? Because we don't find that. We find the Midanim are the ones who have possession of Yosaif when he gets to Egypt, or the ones who sell him to Egypt. Okay? And Siddur Chachamim says they obviously are a different nation because we have the verse that's Midan, Midjan. Two different sons of Avram and Keturah. One is Midan, one is Midjan. They're two different nations. So what forces Rashi to say the Midyanim were even involved in this transaction? And the answer is, he says, here's where he gets it from. If the Midianites were not somehow involved in this transaction, there was no reason for the Torah to tell us that they passed by. Who cares? There probably were other people who passed by who minded their own business and just ignored what was going on and just kept going. So the fact that it mentions the Midyanim passing through, obviously the Torah mentioned it for a reason. They were involved something. We're forced to say, as far as the sale of Yosaif was concerned, he's got because of Yishmaelim machru otol Midyanim uMidyanim leMidanim uMidanim lePotifar. So they're really, now the Siddur Chachamim is adding a different sale that Rashi did not mention, because Rashi said the Midyanim and the Midanim are one and the same. But Siddur Chachamim is saying, no, it can't possibly. We know they're two different nations. So it has to be, if I want to follow along Rashi's direction, the brothers sold him to the Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelites sold him to the Midianites. The Midianites sold him to the Medanites. And the Medanites are the ones who sold him to Potiphar. So he's not sold 3 times like Rashi wants to say, but actually 4 times. Okay. That's Siddur Chachamim trying to explain how Rashi arrived at his opinion. Now I'm going to continue with a number of different parshanim. We're going to follow in Rashi's footsteps to tell us that it was the brothers who actually were involved in the sale. And then after that, we're going to go, in the second half, we're going to go to all the parshanim who say, no, it was the Midianite traders who are the ones who picked Yosef out of the pit. But let's continue with Radak, who follows along in Rashi's footsteps and says the following. However, a slightly different interpretation. He says these anashim mijanim, these Midianite traders, merchants who passed through, Hema Ishmaelim, says Zachar. These were the same as the Ishmaelite caravan that we talked about, Ki Hem Hamijanim. But it wants to tell us that even though the brothers looked from afar, they looked like Ishmaelites, it was really Midianites. They weren't really Ishmaelites, they were really Midianites. Midianim, we know, are B'nai Keturah. Now, Radak says, Vim Keturah zu Hagar, according to the Midrash that says Keturah and Hagar were one and the same, Hine B'nai Yishmael, B'nai Keturah Achim. The Ishmaelites and the Midianites and the Medanites are all full brothers. They're not half brothers in different tribes. They're all brothers of same parents. Even if we don't accept that medrash, the Keturah and Hagar are the same, at least Kula Hayu B'nei Avraham. They're still all descendants of Avraham, so they're all kindred tribes. And here he adds a very interesting thing. Since they were, related tribes, they obviously intermarried, which is why he says this whole group, this Midianites, Ishmaelites, is all one group of people. Some of them were Midianites, some were Medanites, some were Ishmaelites, but since they had intermarried so much, they were virtually indistinguishable. And then he brings a pasuk to prove that. From that, okay, all right. Now, and why does he say? What is Midan? Midyanim are the ones who sold them to Egypt, as we saw in the pasuk. Okay. Now, again, Radak. Good. They were all wearing the same robes. Stan was saying. I'm sure their garb was probably very similar, and I'm sure Abraham's. From a distance, clearly you could not tell. I doubt that from the distance they could tell whether they were Ishmaelites, Midianites, Medanites, although Ramban is going to have a very different take on that. We'll see when we get further along as to different roles that these different tribes played. But at this point, from Radak's perspective, the three are interchangeable in garb, and not only that, because of the intermarriage between these three tribes, because they're all kinsmen. They clearly were indistinguishable. They were the same exact people. So the brothers may have looked from afar. They looked like Ishmaelites, and there are those among Parshatim. I don't remember if I brought one of them down. Saying the Ishmaelites is the general name for all of these tribes. And then when they realized, it was specifically this branch of the Ishmaelite family, the Midianite branch, the Medinite branch, so that they're all. That's another Parshat. I don't remember if I brought somebody down with that opinion or not, because I don't even remember. I went through so many Parshatim. It's like. Don't remember exactly which ones I brought down and which ones I didn't. Okay. But again, Radak goes back and falls back to Rashi's for perspective that who was the one who drew down the ropes, sent the rope down into the pit so Yosaif could come, they could pull Yosaif out. This was Achei Yosef Mishachuhu, Ve'alu min habar, u'mecharu le'yishmaelim. The first, again, Radak goes with Rashi, that the first sale was by the brothers to the Ishmaelites. But he says, by the way, Reuven lo haya imahem. Reuven was not present at the time of the sale. Perhaps he had gone off on a tangent somewhere. We don't know where Reuven was, but he wasn't there because we see it a couple sukim later. Reuven returns to the pit and says, "Wait, Yosef isn't here. What happened to him? Where did he go? Where did he disappear to?" So obviously he wasn't there if the brothers are the ones who pulled him out of the pit. Obviously Reuven wasn't there at the time. Okay. All right. Now, so those are the two primary sources who say that the brothers are the ones who sold him. By the way, Yalkut Shimoni, I just want to quote this. This is totally has nothing to do with who sold Yosef, but a very interesting midrash that I've seen many times. I wanted to bring it down here. The brothers had a problem once Yosef had been sold. Primarily according to this opinion that it was the brothers. The brothers had a dilemma. What are we going to do now? What's going to happen when Abba finds out? We are in deep trouble. Abba's going to find out. He's going to be a little upset about this. Amru, so the brothers said, "Nacharim beinenu, we are going to declare a cherem she'ein echad mimenu magidet hadavar zel Yaakov. Nobody's allowed to tell Abba." Amar lem Yehuda. Yehuda said, "Wait, we got a problem here. Reuven enu kan ein cherem mikayim b'tisha. You can't declare a cherem without a minion. We only got 9 of us here. Reuven's not around. We got a problem. How are we going to declare a cherem?" So what did they do? Asu shatful amakom iman v'charmu. They said, "Hashem, you're number 10. we're making a cherem that nobody's allowed to tell Yaakov, and you Hashem are included. Okay, and when Reuven comes back, they told him he heard and had to acquiesce because it was declared by a minion. The this Hashem does not reveal to Yaakov what happened to Yosaif. 22 years go by, and Yaakov has no clue what has happened to Yosaif. Now, we would have thought that prophetically he might have had some idea. The answer is no. Hashem couldn't tell him either because of this cherem. Nice, it's a nice midrash. One of the more interesting midrash that you include Hashem in a cherem, but you can't tell somebody something. So next time you have 9 people, you want to keep the secret, remember you can include Hashem. Okay. And ultimately, when the brothers find out that who Yosaif is, what he is, what's happened to him 22 years later, they rescind the cherem and they're able to tell Yaakov. And therefore, the pasuk says about ruach Yaakov avim, the spirit of Yaakov is lifted. And what is this ruach? It's the ruach hakodesh. He wants to say that Hashem had taken away from him because Hashem could not reveal what had happened to Yosef. Okay, I just thought it has nothing to do with our story. I just wanted to put that in there just because I always found that midrash fascinating. Okay, now we go to the second side of the coin. The other side of the coin is, pasuk says that the Midianite traveler, tradesman passed by. They, and we know that they always refers to the last one. It was the Midianites who lowered the rope, raised up Yosaif, and sold him to the Ishmaelites. Let's see what happened according to the Rashbam. Now remember, Rashbam is Rashi's grandson. He always takes generally takes a very, very straightforward approach to the pasuk, and that's what he's doing right here. So here's what he says. They were sitting, obviously they had distanced themselves from this pit where they had just thrown Yosaif into this pit in the desert. They distanced themselves before they sat down to eat. Why? They didn't want to eat while he was sitting there screaming on his blood, on his own blood. They were waiting for these Ishmaelites that they had seen. The Kodem Shabo HaYishmaelim, before the Ishmaelites arrived, even though they could see them in the distance, I guess they had bigger camels. Avru Anoshim Midyanim Acherim. Another group of Midianites passed by, Derech Sham, along this whatever route they were passing. Vera'uhu Babor. They saw, perhaps, or heard Yosef in the pit. Umishachuhu, and they drove the rope to him. Umecharuhu Amijanim liYishmaelim. And when the Ishmaelim arrived, I guess if we think about the geography that the Rashbam is laying out here, it seems that the Ishmaelites were coming, as I said, from the northeast. The Midianites came from some other direction where the brothers didn't even see them. So they were perhaps, the brothers had stationed themselves at a distance from the pit. Perhaps it was, again, if you've ever been to Shechem, you know that it's not the flattest place in the area where you can see everything going around. Happen to be lots of mountains like Eval and Grizim that we know about. So it's entirely possible that where the brothers were sitting from this pit, distance from this pit, the Midianite traders were able to come from another direction. They were able to raise Yosef from the pit. They were able to get him to the Ishmaelites before the brothers even realized the Ishmaelites had gotten there. The Yesh Lo Mashoachim Lo Yadu, and therefore it's entirely possible that this entire transaction happened with the brothers not knowing. Now, if we go back to the Sifsei Chachamim's question, who says, well, wait a minute, how could the Midianites have sold him if they didn't have title to him? Well, the answer is they did. If the brothers weren't there, the brothers left him in the pit, and the Midianites found him in a pit. Okay, hey, there's this nice little guy here. Okay, we'll make him our slave. We'll sell him. What's the problem? All right, he's hefker. He's ownerless. Nobody's claiming him. So we raised him up. We saved his life. Now we have title to him, and we're going to sell him. So that doesn't seem to bother Rashbam at all. That question of Sifsei Chachamim's problem with Rashi. Possession is 9.5 of the law. But okay, yes. Or as we say in the Gemara, you got possession. You somebody else wants to take that away from you. They got to bring proof that you're not the real owner. Okay. Now deals with another question. Rashbam says, but wait a minute. you know, Sitzacham raised another issue. By the way, Sitzacham is well after Rashbam, but Rashbam is already anticipating the questions, the reason, the rationale that people are going to bring to support Rashi. Yosaif himself says that you are the ones who sold me to Egypt. Yesh Lomar, what does it mean that you sent me, that you sold me to Egypt? Shehagramta Maseyam Sia b'mechirato. Your deeds are the cause. In other words, you're the ground, you're the reason. Why was I in the pit in the first place? Because you guys threw me in the pit. So you are responsible for whatever happens to me once I'm in the pit, even though you may not have been the one who actually sold me. You were responsible for the fact that I got sold because you were the ones who put me in the pit in the first place. Rashbam says, this seems to me the most logical and straightforward way to understand this whole situation. And the reason is, mashma al yedei mikreh. It seems Vayavru, they passed by. They didn't. It wasn't like the Midianites had an appointment. We know the other brothers are going to throw Yosef in the pit. Let's make sure we're there. No, they just happened to chance by. They saw Yosef, and they decided by chance to make this happen. Now, by the way, Rashbam says one more thing. Even if you want to say, even if you want to say that the brothers are the ones who were responsible for the sale, in other words, they were the ones who sold Yosef to the Ishmaelites, we still have, Rashbam still says that Vayimshechu has to be talking about the Midianites. So if you want to insist, based on Yosef's own words, that the brothers are the ones who sold him, then you're still going to have to say that the brothers used the Midianite traders or merchants as their middleman to raise Yosef from the pit and then sell him to the Ishmaelites. So the brothers didn't want, they authorized the Midianites to pull him out of the pit and do it, because clearly those three things all go together and they all were done by the Midianites. Now, what he's saying is, the plain, simple sense is that they did it without necessarily the brothers even knowing about it. But he says, if you insist that the brothers knew about it because of what Yosaif says later on, all right, that's fine. Then the brothers authorized them to be their agents to take care of this transaction. Go ahead.
And then when he's
okay, it's good answer. All right, David wants to suggest that Yosef may have been within earshot of the brothers and heard them discussing possibly selling him, and therefore he says that, you may not have sold me, but you were willing to sell me. And that's why he says, you were the ones who sold me, because it was your idea anyway to sell me. And the fact that you didn't directly carry it out, but you were the agents of it happening, clearly is enough for rational. That's another. No, yeah. No, the brothers couldn't deny it because they clearly had intended to sell him no matter what. Absolutely. Okay. Midrash Sechel Tov says the following, very interesting. Vayavru. Now, we've translated Vayavru is these Midianite traders happened to pass by. But he says very interestingly that Vayavru has another meaning. He says, Kolomar, Kadmu Anshe Midyanim Socharim Vigiu Eitzlach Yosef Kodem Shigiu Yishmaelim. Vayavru, to lavor, can also mean to pass in front of somebody, to overtake somebody. So he says that these Midianite merchants preceded, I guess they hurried, perhaps they were part of the same caravan, but they kind of left the caravan to quickly go ahead. Why? We don't know, but they did whatever reason they had, they reached the brothers before Yosef. And he brings a number of different, I'm not going to go into this, he brings another different places where this Vayavor refers to overtaking somebody. What? That the mincha went before him. Yeah, and we have it in a number of places in Tanakh where la'avor means to overtake. The most famous is the story of in David, but we'll leave that for another time. Okay. Ulufi now. Since these Mijanim were also descendants of Avraham, and they got there before the Yishmaelim, the brothers didn't really care. The brothers were perfectly willing. They didn't care who they sold them to. They just wanted to sell them to somebody who they felt was going to take him out of the neighborhood, out of the region, possibly out of the country. The brothers' intent in selling Yosaif was to get him out of their hair. They were concerned. He was creating all sorts of problems in the household. The further away, if they'd have found a slow boat to China, they would have sold him on a slow boat to China. They wanted to sell him to who they felt would take him the furthest away, and they figured whoever's first taker is fine. Midian, wherever you're going back. The brothers assumed that whichever caravan came would take them somewhere out of the way, to out of the way place where he would not be able to get back. He would be sold as a slave in some faraway place and would remain there forever. Okay. So therefore, the brothers sold them to the Midianites. And since the brothers already sold him, the Midianim, having accepted title of Yosaif, so now the Midianite, they had to collect their purchase. So how did they do that? They lowered a rope and they pulled him out of the pit, which makes sense. Now, interestingly, the Mishnah adds another few things. Wait a minute. Even Sheheluhu, after the Midianites had raised Yosef out of the pit, the brothers had regret. However, when the Ishmaelites arrived, when the Midianites sold him to the Ishmaelim for 20 pieces of silver, then let's skip all this. So then they were okay. Okay. So he goes through a whole thing and turning different sales. But the point is, once the brothers saw that, he ended up with the Ishmaelim, they were perfectly happy too. Even though they would have been just as happy had the Midianites taken him, they were just as happy that the Midianites sold him to the Ishmaelites and he was off and away and out of their hair. That's all they cared about. Okay. Chiskuni. Okay, also goes along the same shot. He says, who are these Anashim Midianim? They passed by Eitzel HaPorsha Yosef Mushlach Sham. What does it say? V'shamu shahayat soek ubocha. The Midianite merchants heard him crying, yelling and crying. So obviously he was calling for help. Obviously he's in the bottom of a pit, in the middle of nowhere. You figure anybody passes by, I'm going to call out and see if they can help me. Now, obviously, as David says, he must have heard. Not only did he possibly hear the brothers, but he obviously heard these Midianites passing by. If they were close enough to notice there was somebody in the pit, they obviously were close enough that they made some noise passing by. Yosef tried to get their attention by yelling and crying. By Midianim at Yosef, when they realized a person there, they raised him out. They sold him to the Ishmaelim. However, the Ishmaelim misarul pikadon liyad hamidianim. The Ishmaelim, even though they had now taken title of him, they let the Midianites be the ones to handle him. Since the Midianites had been the ones who drew him out of the pit, the Ishmaelite purchasers decided to allow the Midianite merchants to continue to handle him. The Nimkar lePotifar biyad shnehem, and therefore, when they get to Egypt and sell him, Potiphar buys him from both of them. And that's why in one verse it says Potiphar buys him from the Midianites. In another verse it says Potiphar buys him from the Ishmaelites. Chizkuni wants to say that the reason for that is because they had a partnership. Okay, the Ishmaelites bought him from the Midianites who had pulled him out of the pit, but they did not want to take possession of him immediately. In other words, the Ishmaelites I bought him for the sake of reselling him. So they didn't care to have him in their possession as long as the people who had him in possession were traveling in the same caravan. And therefore, through this, we can now understand the three different verses. Now, interestingly enough, he doesn't quote the pasuk correctly. He quotes the verse. The way he quotes the pasuk, it says Hamidyanim. So what he's saying is, even though the Torah says Midanim without the Yud, it's probably he's saying it's a diktok. So yeah, it's a typo in the Torah, right? It was really the Midyanim. Okay. Again, Midan and Midjan, they're brothers. They're clearly, seemingly would be interchangeable. I don't know why your mother would give two kids one name Midan and one Midjan. I have no idea, but that's a whole different story. But clearly, the fact is, the Chizkuni quotes that it's Midjanim who sold them to Egypt, Potiphar, Umikras Azav, Potiphar, Miyadi Yishmeelim. So all of these three psukim, one, that the Midyanim are the ones who sold him to Egypt, and Potiphar bought him from the Yishmeelim because it was the Yishmeelim who were the owners, but the Midyanim who had possession of him, who were the handlers. And Yosaif said, the brothers said, why does Yosaif blame the brothers telling him? You are the ones who caused me to get sold. Okay, the Echav lo yad he calls out. He says clearly, definitively, the brothers didn't have any clue what was going on, and that's why that's why when Reuven looks for him and he's not there, they all thought that somehow he had been removed from the pit by some wild animal. The lo shakru li'avim, and they didn't lie to their fathers when they said some wild animal would eat him. Okay? Because had they sold him, had their father found out that they had been sold, Yaakov would not, had he had any doubt that Yosef was still alive, he would have overturned heaven and earth to try to find him. It was only the fact that the brothers said he was devoured by a wild beast, that Yaakov didn't send search parties to all four corners of the earth to look for him. Okay? The Ode, and another reason why it has to be that the brothers believed he was dead. How, if the brothers had any inkling that Yosef was still alive, it has to be that the brothers had no clue that he was alive, because had they had any inkling that he would have alive, well, how come they didn't recognize him? I mean, okay, I understand they didn't recognize him immediately. He was wearing Egyptian clothes. He was dressed in Egyptian clothes. But after speaking to him, after all these different interchanges of speech, they didn't recognize his voice. And his way he treats Binyamin, and he gives him 5 wonderful gifts, and he seats the brothers at this meal that he makes for them later on in their direct order of birth. How come on? They couldn't have guessed it was Yosef. The reason they didn't guess it was Yosef because they had no inkling that Yosef was even alive. Had they might have put the pieces together, connected the dots, and figured out, oh, this must be Yosef, because it's very strange things going on here. But they did. Why did they kill the goat? Yeah, David says, if I believe what was it? Was this Chizkuni we're talking still? Are we still in Chizkuni? Well, if we believe this whole perspective, why did the brothers kill a goat, slaughter a goat, dip the blood in, dip Yosef's coat that they had taken off into the blood and bring it back to their father? The answer is because they needed some proof, that they needed something tangible that he had been eaten by a wild animal. The wild animal wouldn't have eaten the coat, and the fact that they had the coat, if they had no blood on the coat, how could the animal have eaten him and not left a drop of blood? So they had to put blood on the coat. Right? No, they couldn't. The point is they needed something tangible so their father would believe the fact that Yosef was really dead. And the fact that they had the coat made it easy to fabricate the evidence. If they hadn't had the coat, then they would have had no way to fabricate evidence. What would they have fabricated? They couldn't have, it wasn't like they had anything left. But the question, and this begs the question, doesn't say anywhere that they ripped the coat, that they put teeth marks in the coat. So, I mean, how would the animal, unless the whole point is Yosaif took the coat off to try to fight the animal, and then they got blood on it. I don't know what story they told their father. It's a great question, but clearly the fact that they put the blood on the coat was intended to assuage their father to that he wouldn't go send search parties looking for him. Okay. Now, again, according to this interpretation, they really believed that Yosaif had been carried away and eaten and was gone, according to this. Okay.
So with this interpretation,
Yeah. The brothers are not involved. Their only involvement was that they put him in the position where he could be sold by putting him in the pit. And that's exactly what, but even Rashbam said the same thing. I mean, so all of the Parshanim who say that the brothers are not involved have to translate that verse, Asher Mechartem Oti Mitzrayma, as you're the indirect cause. Maybe not the direct cause, but you're the indirect cause of me having been sold. It's your fault. It's your fault because you put me in the pit. You put me in the place where I was sold. Okay. Another interpretation now, he brings another interpretation, by the way. The other interpretation is, okay, we just gave you an interpretation that they showed up, snatched Yosaif, sold him without the brothers knowing. That's one way of looking at it. But there's another way of looking at it, he says. They were discussing to sell him to Ishmaelim. The Midianites showed up. They said, hey, we got people right here. Let's sell them right now. So they sold him to the Midianites. And while he was, without taking him out of the pit, why did they sell him right away without taking him out? Perhaps he would cry in front of them and they would be embarrassed. So then, clearly, if the Midianites now owned him, they clearly would have been the ones to lower the ropes and raise him from the pit. They brought him from the brothers. They were still picking him up from the pit. The Ishmaelites showed up. The Midianites sold him to the Ishmaelim. The Ishmaelim sold him to the Midianim back, or to the Midanim, and the Midanim sold him to Potiphar Kandal Mechior. So now we have 4 different times he sold brothers to the Midianites, Midianites to the Ishmaelites, Ishmaelites to the Medanites, Medanites to Potiphar. Okay. Now, there's only one little problem with that. Later on, it says, how could Potiphar brought him from the Ishmaelites if the Ishmaelites had already sold him off to the Medanites, and it says the Medanites sold him to Potiphar? So he says, this is really what happened. The brothers sold him to the Midianites. And that sale was not written in the Torah, because it was not intended to be a long-term sale. It was a very short duration sale. The brothers wanted to sell him, and knowing that the Midianites were going to turn him over to the Ishmaelites when the Ishmaelites got here. The Midianites, the brothers did it to save face, so they didn't have to be the ones to take Yosaif out of the pit. So they sold him. They're merchants. They're buyers and sellers. We buy something that we know we've got a steady market for. We'll buy it and we'll sell it at a profit. And we want to get it off our hands as quickly as possible. We want to turn over. They were into the turnover. That's what they were into. So the Midianites, Mecharul Ishmaelim, so as soon as they found ready buyers, they sold them to the Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelites sold them to the Midanim, even though he spells it Midyanim. This third one isn't explicitly written. The Ishmaelim had to sell him quickly also, or sort of in a haste, and hidden. Ki amru, because you know what? Perhaps the Midianites will regret having sold it to us when they see there are other buyers. The Midianites are coming to buy it. However, the Midianites sold it to Potiphar. Now, there's a problem. Now, he still hasn't identified why does it say that the Ishmaelim are the ones who sold Yosaif when he got to Potiphar? Okay, here's why. Potiphar Yosaif the Midianites were traders, and they were the brothers of the Ishmaelim. But when Potiphar sees that Yosaif, this beautiful young guy, is owned by these guys, he says, Tama bi'atzmo. He said, wait a minute. He says, Garmani mocher et kushi? Normally, it's the fair-skinned guy who's selling the dark-skinned guy. Khan and kushi mocher et Garmani. We generally do not have a dark-skinned guy who owns a light-skinned guy selling him. Doesn't work. Perish Adam Yafeh. Garmani is, he translates Garmani as Adam Yafeh. Amar Potiphar Vadai Zeh Eino Evid. This guy is not a slave. Where'd he come from? I want some assurance that this guy is really your slave, you really own him. Tanuli Arev, give me an assurance, Shloganav Timoto, that you didn't steal this guy. So Holchla Midyanim, where did the Midyanim go? They brought the Ishmaelites. The Arvu Shalogan Vul, and they backed up their word that he wasn't stolen. Not me, but miyad hayishmeelim, at the hand of the Ishmaelites. Perish marvutam. It's because of their backing that the trade was valid, or it's their guarantee that the trade that Yosaif was valid, that was their property to sell. The Ishmaelites backed them up. So they were the guarantors of the sale. Okay, so we have all sorts of different opinions as terms of who's doing what. I'm going to quickly skip through a whole bunch of others that I had brought down because I see my time is running short here. But again, we have all sorts of different variations of the different. I want to end with Ramban's thing, which is all the way down here after a few more. I got to get to it. My mouse is not running tonight, so it's having trouble getting down. I apologize. Last but not least is the Ramban. Come on. It's always the last one. I put him at the bottom because I knew I was going to end with him. All right, we have to skip everybody else and go to Ramban at the bottom here. So Ramban looks at this whole thing and wants to tell us that each of these three different parties had different roles in the sale. And that's, hold on, here we go. Okay. Now he goes back to, again, the brothers saw first. He starts with the brothers seeing the Ishmaelites. Oh. All these today? Okay. When the brothers sat down after putting Yosef in the pit, they looked in the distance. They saw a group of people coming from Gilad, as I said, northeast. Hikiru, they recognized Kirchat Yishmaelim hi bigmalim. They knew it was an Ishmaelite caravan because of the camels. Who traveled with camels? Ishmaelites. V'yadu, and they knew Kila Mitzrayim Yelechu. If they were coming from Gilad, they would be traveling to Egypt. Kimi Gilad Yuva Hatzariv Anachot LeMitzrayim V'Hayadar Kam Laholich Otam. The Ishmaelite caravans from Gilad would carry the balm and all the other spices from Gilad because they knew they had a ready market for it in Egypt. These guys, they're Ishmaelites. They're from who knows where. They're not from our place. And they're going to a distant land. Nimkarenu lahem, let's sell Yosef to him. Kilo yivadah hadavar. Through that, nobody will find out what happened. The kasher karvulahem, but when the caravan approached, mat'ud ki hayu balei schora, they found that the people who actually owned the merchandise on the caravan, who owned the balm and the spices that were being sold in Egypt, were not the Ishmaelites, but they were Anashim Mijanim Socharim. They were Midianite merchants. The Midianite merchants were the ones who owned the goods that were being transported by the caravan. Who owned the camels of the caravan? That they rented the camels, or the use of the camels, from the Ishmaelites. Okay? But the Ishmaelites were the camel drivers. Okay? So the Ishmaelites are the camel drivers who are running the caravan. They're the caravan masters. They're the truckers who are providing the good, who are providing the transportation. But the real owners who were traveling, of course, with the spices, because they didn't have, FedEx back then, they are traveling, find out they are Midianite merchants. So Vayimkuru, the brothers, sell Yosaif to the Midianites travelers, Shekanu Oto, because the Midianites, they're merchants. They'll buy anything they have a ready market for. Shekanu Oto, Lismora. They don't buy him to keep him as their slave. They buy him to sell him wherever, when they get to the next marketplace. The Yishmaelite camel drivers didn't want to be traders. They just rented their camels to whoever was using them. They didn't care whether you made a profit on what you were bringing or not. You're paying me for the use of the camel. That's all I want. That's my business. I'm not in the buying and selling business. I'm in the camel driving business. You want my camels? Fine. Do whatever you want with them.
Precursor to the troubles.
That's what I'm saying. They're precursors to the troubles. They don't care what they're doing. They are not going to buy. Okay. However, okay. But however, the pasuk says, "Vayimkot Yosef la'Yishmaelim," that they sold Yosef to the Ishmaelim. Kilo masru otam, kilo hema masru otam. What does it mean that they sold Yosef to the Ishmaelites? To the care of the Ishmaelites, because the Ishmaelites are the ones who took physical control of Yosef to transport him. They were the truckers. They had to put him in the truck. They put him on the camel. Once he's part of the goods that the Midianites are transporting, the Ishmaelites are responsible for the goods, and they put him with the goods, and they keep moving. So therefore, it says they sold Yosef to the Ishmaelites. And that's why when Potiphar buys them, says he buys them. Who does he buy them from? He buys them from the Ishmaelim. He doesn't buy them from the Ishmaelites as the owners. He takes possession of Yosef from the Ishmaelim because they're the ones who have possession of him. The Midianites were the owners who transacted the business. They were the ones who dealt with Potiphar. That's what it says in our parshat. It says the Midanim/Midyanim, who again Ramban is following Rashi by saying Midanim and Midyanim are two names for the same group. They are the merchants. They are the middlemen who buy and sell goods. That's all they do. They buy stuff where it's cheap, sell it where it's expensive, and they get the Ishmaelites to truck it there and truck them there so they can transact the business. So therefore, all the psukim make sense. The fact that it says that they were sold to the Ishmaelim means to the care of the Ishmaelim because they're the truckers. The fact that he sells that the Midianim are the ones who are selling them because they are the ones who have title to him. So there's two different responsibilities here. One is title to Yosef. The other is the person who has physical custody of Yosef. And that's what Ramban wants to say. And that's exactly how it's written. Oh, now, by the way, Ramban now has to answer just one little last question, that if the Midianim were the ones who pulled Yosef out of the bar, what does it mean that who is responsible? Why does it use different names? He says you have to understand this is the normal way of the Torah. That when we have two parties involved in an action, one is the delegate, the designator, the sender. The other is the representative, the agent who is doing it. Sometimes it will tell us that the person did it, and other times it will tell us the agent did it. And that's normal Torah usage, and he brings a number of different cases where that happens. And similarly, one of them he brings out is Yosef Atzmo. But Ramban wants us to understand that the different players in the same one caravan, there were two different groups of people. There were the merchants, there were the camel drivers. And the brothers are transacting business with the merchants, and so is Potiphar, but the Yishmaelites are the ones, the camel drivers are the ones who are taking physical custody of the goods. And that's the way he wants to do it. But the final thought he has, as I said, is very interesting because it says, the fact that it says that Yosaif, in any case, that Yosaif says that the brothers are responsible is clearly I think the key point in this whole story. Whether it's the brothers who sold him, whether it's the merchants who pulled him out of the pit, it really doesn't matter in the end. In the end, the bottom line is that the brothers are the responsible party for Yosef ending up in Egypt. In reality, as Yosef himself says later on, you didn't really, aren't the ones who sent me there. God's the one who sent me here. And we can clearly see that also in the story about the fact that Yosef looks for his brothers, can't find them, and some mysterious guy shows up in the middle of nowhere and makes sure Yosef finds his brothers in the first place, long before he gets into the pit to begin with. We didn't talk about that, but that's a whole different story, that it's the hand of Hashem. But again, the fact that it's the hand of Hashem does not absolve us, human beings, from our role in the incident. And that, I think, is one of the key lessons of the whole story of Yosef and his brothers, that even though Yosef is willing to forgive them, the brothers still bear some level of responsibility for the actions that led us to ultimately end up in Egypt, which ultimately, of course, leads to the Egyptian exile. And I don't remember who it is, one of the parshanim, I think maybe it was That's Cain, I don't remember who. This goes no, it was Sforno. I don't know. I don't remember who. Gives a whole moral lesson that, and he compares it to Bayit Sheni, where there was a period during the Hasmonean, not the revolt, but after the revolt, after they were Hasmonean kings, where there was a quarrel over who was to be king, and who did they go to ask to adjudicate the quarrel? None other than Rome, and that's how Rome ultimately gains a foothold in power over the Jews, and ultimately leads to the Churban Bayit and the exile, the second exile from Eretz Yisrael. So we have to understand that the responsibility, our responsibility as human beings with Bechirach of Sheet, is to try to make sure that we don't allow Sinat Chinam to take us to places where we shouldn't be in terms of dealing with our brothers. That we have to understand that no matter how much we have differences, whatever those differences might be, we certainly have more in common than we do differences. And we need to focus on those things that we have in common so that we can live in peace and harmony and help each other grow in our awareness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in our observance of Torah and Mitzvot. And when we're able to do that, get our act together, then we'll be able to undo all of these wonderful things that caused exile, and we'll be ultimately bring about Mashiach B'meher Yameinu. So thank you all. I open up the floor for questions, comments, feedback at this point. Anybody? Okay, I guess that's it then. I will say thank you all. Have a wonderful evening, a wonderful rest of the week, and Be'ez Hashem will try to do it again next week. Happy Hanukkah to all, and Shabbat Shalom, and Happy Hanukkah in that order. Take good care. Be well. Bye-bye.